Real GDP per capita growth negative for the past 20 years. This is per use of the 1980 methodology of computing the monetary inflation rate as shown on Shadowstat's site and making use of the official population inflation rate with the yearly nominal GDP figures. The real GDP growth without putting into terms of per person is erroneous as it does not capture the effects of population growth. Even as population growth in the United States has been around 1% to drifting lower, this is a significant item which must be accounted for. A real GDP growth rate of 1% could render the real GDP per capita growth rate down to zero. It is far more relevant, except in making comparisons of one country to another, to be focusing on the per capita GDP growth rate as this is what is being experienced per person. It should be well understood that if the GDP doubled, with monetary inflation at zero, and if the population doubled, there would be no sense of improvement as the GDP growth per capita would remain the same. Let this sink in, then you will see more clearly how our government pushes propaganda in either supplying false data, using faulty working up of data, and in not supplying the relevant data. Here is a new word for many: imputation. Imputations are fictitious calculations attributing value directly from the BEA. Examples include the services of owner-occupied housing, financial services provided without charge, and the treatment of employer-provided health insurance. This means owner-occupied homes are included in the GDP figure in the sense that a fictitious amount derived from the estimation of how much would be paid if the home were rented. Sounds like a scam to me. The government keeps finding ways to make the GDP get bigger, hence giving the impression that the economy is booming. In recent years, government made an overhaul on GDP inclusions to capture even more gains. What I am showing here are since year 2001, the real GDP growth rate per capita, and though you will see a minuscule gain in year 2004, realize that with deficit spending it's pretty much reduced to zero, so the overall statement of negative real GDP growth per capita for the past 20 years remains correct as far as a broad assessment. I tried in many ways and in studying the issue that there is no easy direct way to account for deficit spending into the real GDP growth rate, either alone or as a GDP growth rate per capita figure. It's just too intractable with many variables, and there is no knowing just how much is being borrowed simply to take up for us lack of tax revenue shortfalls, increased spending on military, increased federal employee compensation which does not imply the money gets spent right away, and a long list of other items. The fact remains the case though that the increase in the national debt is bad for the economy and should be a figure shown in every instance whenever speaking of the real GDP growth rate to get a fuller picture of the actual health of the economy. When deficit spending has been around 5 to 7% of the GDP over the past 10 years, surely the impact of this in propping up the GDP should be realized, even as intractable it is to account for it objectively. If there were a direct correlation of the deficit spending with effects on propping up the GDP, the real GDP growth figures would be lowered by 5 to 7% in recent years, but it's not so straightforward to make this assumption. Deficit spending has been averaging over $1 trillion per year since 2008. This is unnecessary, though you will hear that social services are largely to blame. Yes, Medicare could be improved, but our dunces in power will never get it right. Social Security payouts could be lowered for high earners who receive much from other sources. It could be lowered less so for those receiving lots, and all the way down to near the lowest recipients, but especially for the second category and even more so for the last category. The cost of living should be made lower. I show how this could be done on my proposed solutions site given to our leaders 10 years ago, but if they chose to be ignorant over the last 10 years, expect them to be ignorant forever. I demonstrate we could save over $1 trillion per year getting government employee compensation down to a reasonable level. Do you think any member in Congress, or the president for that matter, will ever do what is right? I think not. Expect government to keep saying the economy is booming even as the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, which basically is saying the so-called booming economy over the past 10 years was a big fraud. The lie of a booming economy promotes the middle class to spend more of their savings, to not be worried in borrowing, to then later on, with one small bump in the road, leading to a vehicle repossession, or worse yet, repossession of a purchased home. It's like this is the recipe that the Federal Reserve is so happy in doing in order to make the wealth divide so suffocating that the poor and middle class will throw themselves onto the wealthy to accept a job at any rate of pay, and if gets even worse, as in third world countries, human trafficking and prostitution will be ramped up, and the wealthy would be loving the extra power they have over other humans. The official statements of the Federal Reserve gives the impression it is here to help us, as in all of us. The truth is, they are here to benefit the wealthy. End of story. I tried through hundreds of communications with the Federal Reserve over the past 10 years to help guide them to actually help this country, but they really do not want this. The Federal Reserve does not want prosperity for the masses, it wants unbridled prosperity for the top few percent. It should be realized that the wealthy gained in a big way from the unlawful upward manipulation of the stock market, making it presently about 4 to 8 times overpriced, small caps at the high end. Those in the middle class who are absent of analytical abilities may think their punny stock market gains are helping them, but in fact, are setting them back, as there is a twofold situation happening when the middle class goes long the market. They disproportionately make the wealthy far wealthier, and then with that extra wealth, the wealthy can put increased pricing pressures on other assets including homes, so that those in the middle class go lower via inflation, even if having some nominal stock market gains, as the gains would be wiped away, and then some from inflation, unless those gains are at the top end of the middle class. With wages up only 10% since year 2000, it should come as no surprise the figures I am disclosing herein. The average person is spending far less than they were in year 2000 on a real basis, though on a nominal basis they may be spending slightly more. On a real basis, spending activity is actually 30% lower than in year 2000, but from all the inflation, both monetary and population, along with incessant propaganda, it's not so clear unless you have someone like myself showing the truth of the matter.